Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. This is going to be a two-part episode on the Z-Patriot Civil War. In two parts because I'm having to write these and record them in between fairly frequent power cuts, as well as all the various recordings, meetings, etc. that I am conducting here in the field, so to speak. Well, let's jump into this episode. It's about Z-Patriots turning on each other, which is a fairly delicious concept. The civil war has broken out in Russia, but not the one perhaps you imagined or were waiting for. It's a weird civil war between objectionable characters, one happening inside the pro-war camp itself. Z-Patriots and propagandists are turning on each other. The Z-Patriots or turbo-patriots, Telegram war bloggers and Kremlin talking heads who cheered on the invasion are now denouncing, arresting, and in some cases literally killing each other. Foreign agents lists are starting to be formed, terrorist labels are being adding onto some of them, and extremist charges levelled against many of them. Car bombs, gunshots on occupied territory, and Chechen generals promising that troublesome bloggers will be destroyed legally. They also hint at illegal methods, of course, and the law is a fairly redundant concept in Russia. In any case, where strength, status, brutality, and connections define everything. Well, before we jump in further, thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Thank you to everyone who's helped to make this trip possible. And of course, all the events and recordings we're going to be doing between now and the end of the year. If you are able to, please do go to Patreon, buy me a coffee. Your support is absolutely fundamental. I couldn't do any of this without it. Well, this isn't dissent versus the regime. This is the regime's own shock troops turning their knives inward, and the minions of the security state happily twisting the blade round. Let's unpack how we got to the point where, as one Ukrainian advisor put it during an earlier bombing of a Russian war blogger, the spiders are eating each other in a jar. That's from Reuters. Well, what do we mean by a Z-Patriot civil war? First, some definitions. We say Z-Patriots or turbo-patriots. What we mean is that we're talking about ultra pro-war ecosystem. That's the media and social media ecosystem that grew up around Russia's full-scale invasion. This includes Telegram Z channels, frontline bloggers, volunteer fundraisers, ex-officers, mercenaries, etc., etc. It also includes propagandists like Vladimir Solovyov, and of course it would also include propagandists embedded within the Russian army. And then we have a whole segment of this ecosystem which is hard-right ideologues and nationalist writers. For the first 2 years of the war, these people were useful to the regime. They hyped the invasion, they raised money and drones, and uniquely in Putin's system were allowed to insult generals and some officials for being too soft, too ineffective at killing Ukrainians, and not nearly brutal enough. The Guardian recently summed up this turn of the screw. Three figures who embodied this world: political analyst Sergei Markov, war blogger Roman Alyoshin, and RT pundit Tatiana Mantoyan have now been branded foreign agents or even terrorists and extremists by the same state media that they glorified, the same violent, war-loving regime. Well, that's from The Guardian. Analysts quoted in that piece talk bluntly about a new trend, not just repressing so-called liberals and anti-war voices, but purging the regime's own loyalists as rival factions inside the system go after each other. Economist coverage, echoed in other outlets, describes militant bloggers clashing with their own regime and notes that bashing the army for failing to crush Ukraine now risks serious jail time. What looks from the outside like a random crackdown is, inside the Z ecosystem, experienced as an internal war over money, access, and survival, and possibly status as well. But above all, it's about the loot, the bubble, the money. Roman Alyoshin versus Vladimir Solovyov, round one, when charity becomes a crime. Our first character is Roman Alyoshin, a small-town apparatchik turned war blogger whose story reads like a bad satire of Putinism. According to Nova Gazeta Europe, Alyoshin is a former policeman and media entrepreneur from Russia's Kursk region who reinvented himself as a patriotic civic manager once the war started. He ran a popular Telegram channel backing the invasion and raising donations for frontline units. He headed a regional volunteer organization called We Are Together, later became an advisor to the Kursk governor, and even joined the Chechen Akhmat forces for a time. Again, that's all from Nova Gazeta, as is this whole segment. On 19th September 2025, the Justice Ministry suddenly designated him a foreign agent, the first time that label was used against a pro-war blogger. The ministry claimed he'd spread inaccurate information about the authorities intended to create a negative image of Russian servicemen. On Telegram, Alyoshin called the status absurd and protested that he'd never taken foreign money and had been personally sanctioned by Zelensky. This is in Nova Gazeta Europe. Investigations by them and others show that Solovyov's TV network and allied channels accused Alyoshin of misusing donations, buying himself an expensive Zikr car and living lavishly while fundraising for the front. But is corruption and personal enrichment unusual in Russia? No, it's endemic and it's expected. So what's behind the falling out? Alyoshin hit back, sued Solovyov's media in court, and even gave interviews to exiled TV channel Dozhd to defend his reputation. Not a move, actually, that would endear him to the regime, though. And that indeed was his mistake. As analyst Ivan Filipov told Nova Gazeta, Solovyov's linked channels were very happy to see Alyoshin as a foreign agent and already have their eyes on the next target. Well, why the fight? Let's look at it this way. As funds thin out and even dry out in parts of the ecosystem, there are going to be fights. They might look like political fights. Ultimately, they're fights over resources, over money and access. Like a nature film where carnivores battle over the desert watering hole that is drying up in a drought. They'll all die in the end, but the fights to be the last ones standing are even more ferocious for all of that. Inside the volunteer community, the reaction was one of shock and fear. One pro-war volunteer wrote that Alyoshin's case showed a purge had begun and that anyone could now be hit with the foreign agent label. Another called it a desecration of the very concept of law. This is, of course, ridiculous and actually quite amusing. When Russians scream recourse to law, it is of course laughable because there is no law in Russia other than power and status. And when they are favored by the system, these characters would not hesitate to use that same lawlessness of the state to crush others. Filipov warned that this would be a terrible blow for the volunteer movement because state media would use Alyoshin's status to smear frontline fundraisers as crooks, cutting off donations that soldiers rely upon. The cruelty of this system is captured in one short quote from Chechen commander Apti Aludinov, a man that Alyoshin once praised and supported. Asked about his fate, Aludinov replied, "If he did things that made him a foreign agent, that's his own fault. Suck it up." Well, it seems there really is no honor amongst thieves. Next, we're going to look at Montoyan, Kabeleva, and Aludinov, Chechen generals, Z-bloggers, eating their own. The second front in this civil war is the surreal feud around Tatiana Montoyan and Oksana Kabeleva, two pro-war propagandists who managed to get each other into trouble. Montoyan is a former Ukrainian lawyer who moved to Russia, backed the invasion, fundraised for Russian troops, and appeared on state TV. She pushed hardline Z narratives while feuding with other propagandists. This story is taken from Meduza. Then in October 2025, Russia's financial watchdog Rosfinmonitoring added her to its official list of terrorists and extremists, a registry normally reserved for jihadists, ISIS, Navalny-linked activists and other so-called opposition groups. That's from EA Daily. So what was the trigger? Was it an old 2015 video that resurfaced in which Montoyan calls Putin a dumb huila and says that the Crimean referendum was fake? Well, soon after this came to light, her home was raided, she was put under travel ban and her accounts were frozen. But this most likely isn't the only reason. They would have probably known of these materials all this time. So it's a political choice potentially of why to get her now, or, as I say, a feud over money, access and influence. What makes this more than just punishment for blaspheming the leader who is helping to push her under the bus? Well, this is an interesting story. Fellow Z blogger Oksana Kobylyeva, whose Telegram channel Akhranota v Vatniki is widely believed to be part of Solovyov's network, again reported in Meduza. According to their investigation, Kobylyeva boasted that her reporting had helped get Montoyan into trouble. Solovyov congratulated her publicly. She'd essentially hunted down a rival fundraiser and propagandist on behalf of the regime's top TV high priest. In early November, Russia's Center for Countering Extremism detained Kobylyeva herself. Fellow bloggers said she'd been charged with discrediting the army, despite being one of its loudest cheerleaders. That's taken from BBC monitoring.co.uk. Well, why? Because she went after the wrong man. Chechen General Apti Aludinov, commander of the Akhmat unit and now a senior figure in the Defense Ministry's political directorate. Kobylyeva questioned discrepancies in his public version of how two soldiers, Ernst and Goodwin, died after exposing alleged drug dealing by their commander. She essentially implied that Aludinov was contradicting the official line and hinting at high-level corruption. Within days, Aludinov's subordinates issued veiled threats. Solovyov abruptly flipped and denounced Kobylyeva, praising Aludinov as a brilliant Russian general and an outstanding religious thinker. Kobylyeva panicked, deleted posts, apologized for friendly fire that played into the enemy's hands, and blamed Montoyan for everything. Journalist Ilya Shepelin, who tracks pro-Kremlin media, told Meduza that Z supporters shop around for political cover, a patron in the propaganda or security apparatus. But those patrons only defend you when it suits them. In his words, Solovyov works strictly on command. Sometimes the instruction is attack, sometimes don't touch. When a subordinate crosses that invisible line, there's no need to defend them. This is less of a media ecosystem, more of a food chain of hate, loathing, greed, and backstabbing. But we don't mind, as long as it's Z-Patriots that are turning on each other. And remember, always follow the money, because this is at the root cause of many such conflicts. And we are going to see a lot more of these. In tomorrow's episode on the Silicon Curtain channel, we're going to be continuing this story and looking at some of the other feuds that have broken out between Z-Patriot bloggers and propagandists.